Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us during Black History Month for the Race and Justice Imperative, our annual event featuring conversations with some of our nation's most prominent black leaders. First, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, for its support of today's conversations. On the program today, we're going to examine if the nation is moving in the right direction. There's a lot to consider. Are we doing a better job of dismantling systemic racism? And what does systemic racism look like today? What did it look like 20 years ago? Are we centering Black Americans and communities of color in our policies and decision-making for real? And are we building a society that values diversity and inclusivity? I'm especially happy to be joined by my new, very cool colleague, Raquel Martin, Washington correspondent for Nexstar Media Group. Nexstar is our parent. It's the mothership. And I'm really happy to have you here. Thank you so much. She's going to help to lead with a big chunk of these conversations. So Raquel, thank you. We're going to have a good time. We've got some terrific speakers lined up, so stick around for the entire program. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillBHM. We are broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. And as with any live stream, I laugh at this. You could experience occasional trouble with your video. Don't throw your computer out the window. Just refresh the page and they tell me it will all be great. Never works for me, but I hope it does for you. Our first guest is Rashad Robinson. He is so famous, so great, activist and president of Color of Change, an organization that works with corporations and the government to fight racial injustice in politics, culture, the workplace, and the economy. Rashad, we have talked in the past. It's so great to see you again. It's been many years since I was at the Atlantic way back then. Look, I know that Color of Change was created almost 17 years ago, as I understand it. So you're almost at your 17th birthday. And I guess the big question, which is perhaps an unfair one, is how do you know when you've actually begun to see real change? How do you begin? Because I think that a lot of what we're talking about today is that there's posture. Sometimes people appear, like there's change. But, fundamentally, how do you know you've achieved traction and we can begin kind of marking some progress? We have you muted, Rashad, I think. There we go.
For us at Color of Change, one of the things we're very clear about is not mistaking presence for power. Visibility and awareness, retweets, shout outs from the stage are sometimes the things that oftentimes have a lot of currency. It can make us feel like something is happening. But for us at Color of Change, we really think about rule change. Power is the ability to change the rules. And so it's not that presence isn't a good thing. It's not that our stories on the front page of the paper aren't important. It's that we can't mistake that for actually making real change. And we have seen so much visibility around racial justice issues, but that doesn't mean we've actually seen rule change. And so across corporations, across media, and of course government, how we really hold ourselves accountable and how we really hold the standard for what change looks like is when do we actually change the rules, change the dynamics for how things are done, and change the structures of accountability. And I think about that across all the different issues that impact our lives.
Rashad, we're hopefully talking to a lot of people that are coming to this relatively new, because I look at any successful effort's going to involve, bringing along new bedfellows, bringing on new folks to kind of be part of this. And I don't know exactly how to frame this, so I'm going to try. We've been in kind of COVID territory for 2 years, but we've also seen during this period the George Floyd's murder, Ahmaud Arbery's murder, and we see crises just as when Color of Change was created after the Katrina hurricane and the impact on New Orleans, again, how communities of color were disproportionately impacted. I just wonder, as an activist and someone who talks to Washington and the nation, is it good to be centered around crises and critical crises moments, or are there positive agenda items that can also be demonstrative and also be compelling? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I mean, I actually think it has to be a mix of all of those things. I mean, I think that the fact of the matter is when moments of crisis, moments of pain happen, those are times when people are paying attention, right? And in 2020, when many people thought the best we could do in terms of activism was clap outside of windows or uplift investigative journalism, it was racial justice that drove people to the streets, drove multiracial coalitions of people to actually ask for more, pushed corporations to say that Black Lives Matter, and to do all of these sort of statements. And part of what we have to do is civil rights, racial justice infrastructure, is lay the groundwork to keep that energy going when the attention starts to fade. And so part of what we've tried to do is create initiatives that are not simply rooted in the sort of statement of the day, but are rooted in actually moving these institutions forward. And so our work, our change industry work, which is focused on, Hollywood, the music industry, and fashion, which has created roadmaps for these industries to move forward. Our beyond the statement work, which is focused on tech and focused on financial industries, which are, once again, roadmaps, but also demanding racial equity audits and pushing these companies around their policies. And then the work that we're doing every single day in communities around the country in working to hold district attorneys accountable, but also working with the district attorneys that we've helped to elect to help advance deeper understandings of safety and justice, where we can make sure that we are dealing with all the ways in which we over-incarcerate in this country, while also making sure we keep our communities safe, because we are finding solutions that move beyond incarceration. We are reimagining public safety. So for us, these moments happen where more people pay attention. But if we are just playing whack-a-mole with these moments, then we're not actually doing the work to actually move things forward. Over 7 million members are part of Color of Change right now. And that is a result, unfortunately, of a lot of crisis, of people looking for ways to get involved, looking to make their voices heard. But what I hope is that we keep those people involved and activated so that every single day we're finding ways to push the ball forward.
Tell us a little bit more about your tech focus. Their big tech focus is one of the big priorities of Color of Change. And I ask you, just last week, I met with the chairman and CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, and over other things. So they're trying to, acquire Activision Blizzard, and it's going to be a huge tech. But they said, look, we see regulation coming. We don't want to fight it. We want to work with it. But in this environment where I think a lot of the technology industry sees regulation and oversight coming, what would be part of the dashboard that you would have of things that need to be fixed and corrected?
They all say that they see it coming and they don't want to fight it, but they're doing everything they actually can to fight it. And they're fighting it behind the scenes while saying publicly that they want it. They're, padding members of Congress's pockets through lobbyists and trying to make sure that whatever legislation comes in place will actually benefit the companies that have already won, the companies that are already here, make it harder for a lot of new companies to enter the market that will actually create the type of competition that we need, that will benefit all of our consumers, that will benefit users. And so one of the things that is really important to us at Color of Change is true antitrust legislation, legislation that actually holds these companies accountable. Another thing that is important for us is dealing with the ways in which these companies have immunity, especially the social media platforms. So reform of Section 230 is incredibly important. One of the things I think a lot about is sort of Standard Oil. I think about sort of the big companies that had to be regulated in the past. I think about when I go into a supermarket, why our meat is safe, or when I go and sit in a car, why those seatbelts work. And it's because there are rules of the road, not because of the altruism of those companies. It's because there's accountability. And so many of the rules that sort of govern big tech were created before we could even imagine what we're facing right now. So the technology that can bring us into the future is unfortunately dragging us into the past. And we've got to actually make sure that we have 21st century rules to deal with 21st century problems. I recently co-chaired the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder. Information disorder is one of those problems that sort of impacts all other problems we have in public life, whether it's the way in which information disorder impacts public health, ways in which sort of information disorder impacts our democracy or impacts the information we have about each other, the ways in which it can sort of advance violence, be sort of part of why we ended up where we ended up January 6th and even in the lead up to it. So for us at Color of Change, we have to make sure these companies, which have benefited so much from our democracy, which have benefited so much from our economy, don't continue to extract without being accountable for all the ways in which they impact our lives.
So Rashad, what's your gut feeling on that? I mean, this is something I discussed with a lot of senators and congressmen, but to tell you the truth, I don't know where they're really at. I can't tell you where the Biden administration really is at when it comes down to what you said, presence is not power, right? So what is your gut right now as you interact with the Biden administration? You know, are they faking support for you, or are they actually engaged in trying to get some of the change you're talking about with regards to monopolies, regulation of the tech sector, social media platforms?
I mean, I do believe that they are being honest when they say they want a path forward. They recognize that change needs to happen. What I worry about is that they have an kind of an old view of how we actually get there, that they believe that they can get everyone around the table and look people in the eye and shake people's hands and somehow come to some sort of solution. And we saw that on the Build Back Better plan. We saw that on voting rights. And I think what we, I think, have to really understand is that when you talk about issues that impact communities that have been historically targeted, attacked, and exploited, communities that have constantly been at the sort of receiving end of so much of the pain, we will always lose in the back rooms if we don't have the people lined up at the front door. And so for the Biden administration, for our friends in Congress, I think we have to recognize that we are not going to win if we don't actually push hard, if we don't challenge those who are enabling, and that if we don't recognize that as much as there are going to be some people who say they're our friends, they're going to be doing everything possible to keep the status quo in place because the status quo has benefited them. And so, you know, a lot of what we are trying to do here is to create the cultural conditions for more people to recognize why these problems exist, who is to blame, and how we actually have to come together to overcome the barriers to change. And so, you know, I know that there are some that believe that we can just get the social media giants sort of around the table and come to some sort of conclusion. And as someone who spent a lot of time doing that, having a lot of meetings at Facebook and Twitter and Google, and being in those meetings, sometimes having to go to those meetings even after folks like the New York Times exposed that while we were meeting with Facebook, they had hired a right-wing policy shop, PR firm, to lodge attacks at us, and hired this firm to sort of attack us while we thought we were at the table negotiating. We went through a whole civil rights audit with Facebook, only to watch them not implement so much of their own audit. We recognize that there are deep barriers to making this type of change, because at the end of the day, these companies care about the bottom line. They care about growth and profit. And until we put in laws and regulations in place that make our safety and make the integrity of the information one of those things that can thwart their growth and thwart their profit, then we will continue to be in the situation that we're in.
Let me just ask one more question. This is, you know, probably badly constructed, but I'm really enjoying this. And I think these are great moments to sort of learn on how we frame and talk about race, division, experience. You know, when I went to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and my friend who's a poet, Kevin Young, just is the new director there. You know, the truth is, I didn't know much about something like the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. There's a lot about the Black experience in America that I didn't know, just ignorant of. And you know, I think a lot of Americans are there, you know, in that space. And I'm just sort of interested in how we take the lived experience of systemic discrimination in America and give on-ramps to others who haven't had that experience, so that there's empathy, there's understanding, there's concern that it's also their history. I know it's a big question, but I want to take this opportunity with you to just ask you how you've been successful at that. It's really storytelling, right? So how do you...
Yeah, it's such an important question, and thank you for asking it, especially because that type of storytelling actually does open up more opportunity for progress. And some of the attacks that we're seeing around the country on actually teaching Black history are a result of the progress that we made. The sort of desire to remove Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Ruby Bridges from the education of our young people is part of the sort of attempt to actually stop and stall the progress. But when I think about the storytelling that we need, I think we need more storytelling for all of us that help highlight inequality, not as an unfortunate incident, not as some sort of car accident, but as something that is unjust, that we help people underscore sort of all the ways in which there were people, some of them deeply nefarious, and some of them just felt like it wasn't their sort of issue, who stood by or sometimes pushed and made that inequality, made that harm happen. That it didn't just happen, but it was a result of people either remaining silent or people actively putting folks in harm's way. And that the changes that we've seen in this country are as a result of heroes of all races, of all backgrounds, who stood up and pushed for a better tomorrow. You know, sometimes we tell stories about the sort of inequality, and we'll say things like, Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank, instead of saying banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. And, you know, people might think that that's semantics, but when we say Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank, folks ask themselves, well, what is wrong with Black people? Maybe we need financial literacy programs or other programs to help Black people do better inside of institutions which have targeted, exploited, and harassed them and kept them out since the very beginning. And maybe if we say it the other way, banks are less likely to give loans to Black people, we now start having a conversation about what do we need to do systemically about banks. You mentioned the Tulsa riots, and I was just there for the 100th remembrance. And I think about sort of this way in which the community in Tulsa is still dealing with the impact of that. So we don't tell that story about sort of the ways in which that community has not been able to, have everything they want, but we talk about all the ways in which things have been stolen from them. And so that we actually lead ourselves to different solutions. We don't want charitable solutions to problems that are structural. And part of what we have to do is tell new stories, and tell stories where new people can be the protagonists, but where all of us have a role. 5, 10, 15 years from now, the world's going to look very different. One way or the other. And I think all of us have a role in playing and making sure that we advance more equity and more opportunity. And I hope people see this Black History Month, but see every single day after that as an opportunity to engage in just that.
I think that line, we don't need charitable solutions for problems that are structural, I tell folks that's a tweetable moment in this conversation today. Rashad Robinson, President of Color of Change, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And joining us now is Melanie Campbell. Melanie is the president and the CEO of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation and a convener of the Black Women's Roundtable. The National Coalition is dedicated to increasing civic engagement and protecting voting rights in Black communities. Welcome, Melanie. It's so great that you've joined us here today. Obviously, you've had a stellar career, over 25 years in public service, helping push for social justice here in Washington. First off, just wanted to hear more about your background. What would you say is one of your most proudest moments here in Washington?
Oh, one of my most proudest moments. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Happy Black History Month as we also get ready to gear up for Women's History Month. Great time. I guess one of my most, proudest moments really goes back to I'm going to say the election cycles, right? Of seeing in recent times, of course, the first Black woman be elected to be Vice President of the United States, and Kamala Harris. But also knowing that we're owning our power. So it's a collective excitement as opposed to just one thing, and seeing Black women own our power in a way that I think in the long run will lift the nation at the end of the day as we continue to break barriers that have long been systemically making it difficult for us to achieve those higher heights.
Got it. I know you talked about Vice President Kamala Harris and that being a huge moment for Black women. We know also right now the president has put on the table potentially putting a Black woman on the Supreme Court, the first in history. Are you at all, first off, your reaction to this actually coming to fruition? I know you have been at the forefront of trying to get this accomplished. We know the president put this on the campaign trail that he was going to make sure this happened. And now it looks like they're down to 3 potential picks, and this could happen just in a few weeks now.
Yes, we've been working on it even before I came to Washington, D.C., and that's been one of those things that Black women have been aspiring to see happen. You know, we tried to do it during the Obama administration, but we're not successful. So when you think about what that means to be at that table, to have that lived experience at the highest court in the land. We know the issues of racial justice and gender justice, all roads definitely lead through several avenues, and the judicial system is one of those key areas where you can exact justice or you have justice denied. So not being able to see a Black woman, 233 years of the U.S. Supreme Court, not having that lived experience that comes with being not just an African American, but being a woman in this nation, I think will bode well for where women go when it comes to owning our power in this nation. We have a long way to go when it comes to opportunities for women. And so as a Black woman who carries both of those things with me everywhere I go, I also understand that it will matter. It doesn't mean just being Black for Black's sake, but the experience of being in this nation, having to walk through and find your way through and break through those glass ceilings that are there, some of them that are very much visible and in some ways very much invisible, is something I think that will go well for that little girl to be able to see. I can be vice president, which means one day I can be president. I can be on the U.S. Supreme Court. Where else can we go as women in this nation as we break those barriers? I'm excited, cautious, because we know that the attacks will come. Whoever is nominated, the confirmation process has never been easy as we break through those barriers. Women of color have a harder time. So we're also sober about this exciting moment. It's a process to get to the finish line of actually having that Black woman confirmed.
I was just going to touch on, we're not at the finish line. You kind of brought up some of the concerns that have already popped up. We've had different members of Congress touch on their concern that the president is using some sort of affirmative action to put forward a Black woman on the Supreme Court. I guess just your response to some of the reaction we've already gotten from members who are questioning the ability or the ethics, rather, of putting, or specifically saying a Black woman should have the next seat on the Supreme Court.
Those same people didn't question why there had been mostly white men for 233 years. Was that affirmative action? I mean, so what are we really saying? We're saying because you identify with someone who has a lived experience that that's a bad thing. And this is a country that's very, very diverse, but you don't see that. You don't see that in the U.S. Senate. There need more women of color, people of color in these positions because we're not reflecting. It's not about qualifications. These women whose names have been bandied about are exceptionally qualified, but don't have the opportunities. And so I think for the president of President Biden and the Biden-Harris administration to make a pledge and follow through with it is a plus when it comes to elected officials who promise on the campaign trail and find a way not to have happen. Doesn't mean everything that we're pushing for has happened yet, but this is one of those things, and I think it should be celebrated. And for those who don't like it, then fine. I don't. I'm going to be clear about how I say that. I really want them to explain. Well, what is the problem with it being a Black woman?
That's right.
Did you have a problem when it was mostly white men who sit on that bench? You only had a handful that don't fit that bill.
Well, I know you've been keen in trying.
Action?
Right. And I know you've been key in trying to bring attention to qualified candidates, and now it's being narrowed down. So we'll see how it all plays out in the Senate here in the few weeks when we potentially could start having hearings and hear the questions, I guess, some members of the Senate might have. But I know another issue you have mobilized around is voting rights. And that's also been at the forefront of the discussion here in Washington, obviously a gridlocked issue in Congress. And I guess the big question everyone's asking at this point is what more can be done? Is this now a grassroots effort? And I guess what would organizations like your own be doing in the next few months as we lead into the midterms?
A couple of things. One, we know we're in the midterms. We have to organize. We've been encouraging the Justice Department to make sure that they are able to monitor the elections. So as some of these voter suppression laws have taken effect, be there on the ground in the community where voting is happening to be able to witness the voter suppression in real time that we know will happen. The other thing is that the administration to continue to do everything they can through executive actions, but the Congress still must act. If you weren't able to get things moved, you need to find a way to carve out at minimum. This is my organization's opinion, at least, that you carve out some areas of it. Because when I remember watching the debate on the floor when they were trying to move the John Lewis Voting Restoration Act and the Freedom to Vote Act that they combined, trying to maneuver and couldn't get it done because of rules. That people said, oh, well, I voted, some of the Republicans said, I voted for the restoration of the Voting Rights Act in 2006. It was 5 pages. This is 700 pages. Well, find a way to find some element, minimally. They need to restore the enforcement powers of the Voting Rights Act by dealing with Section 4 and 5. Do that minimally. In my opinion, I think that needs to happen. I think the Congress needs to continue to act. The president said that he was not going to give up. Senator Schumer said he was not going to give up. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi said they're not. So that I think that they have to find a way to find some way to continue to put on the floor opportunities to vote on voting rights in some capacity. As if you can't get the whole. That's legislation. Sometimes you can't get all what you need, but you need to continue to find a pathway to deal with the legislative fix, because we're not getting the kind of support that's needed through the Supreme Court at this point.
And what's interesting about this situation in particular is this used to be a bipartisan effort, voting rights. I guess, what is your interpretation of what's at play in this moment? Why have we seen such a dramatic switch? And why is this such a partisan issue, the right to protect access to the voter ballot?
Well, this didn't just start in this moment. It started, quite frankly, with the first African-American president, when President Obama was elected in 2008. 2 years after that, you had all of these voter suppression laws that began to be put on the books. And I would say after the Shelby versus Holder decision in 2013, all we have seen over the last decade now plus is a continuation of rolling back the clock on the access to the ballot and to have that voting, that right protected. And for African Americans in this country, as we are in Black History Month, understand we have always had to have federal intervention to protect our right to vote. So it's never been this moment where we had the freedom, if you will, to vote in this country. So we know we've always had to fight, and we will have to continue to fight, because there are always those who believe that it doesn't take all of us to, or we don't believe that all of us have the right to have self-determination when it comes to the right to vote and the right to elect candidates of choice, or the right to even have a fair opportunity to represent. And that's just not in Congress or the Senate or the White House. It's right there in your local community where you're electing both school boards. And so which is another area that's being under attack these days because of the attack on critical race theory and other things that have nothing to do with K through 12 education. So that's something that history has shown us as we're thinking about history, that we have to keep fighting for it to make sure this democracy is inclusive. And right now, the other part of it is this democracy is really under attack. And the fundamental right to vote is what will help to manage this opportunity for us to keep representative democracy, or we can fall into an autocracy, which happens other places. We think nothing can happen in the United States of America, but we're in this moment right now where we're going to go forward or we're going to go backwards into a place that we've never been.
Well, thank you again, Melanie, for sharing your time, and your work obviously is so important in the midst of these critical issues like you just pointed out. Thank you again for joining us today for this important discussion.
Thank you. So much for the invitation.
And joining us now are Chet Kamara and Ermias Tadasi, co-founders of Black Gen Capital, the first minority-owned investment fund at Cornell University. Chet and Ermias are working to reduce barriers and create opportunities for underrepresented students interested in entering the financial industry after college. And they have just begun their second semester of senior year at Cornell. Chet and Ermias, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you guys are obviously still in college, but doing amazing work at Cornell University. First off, just each of you, could you explain how you got into this? What sparked your interest in financial literacy and investment?
Yeah, so I think it really stemmed from our first experiences at Cornell. Shaq and I both came in pre-med. While we really enjoyed the subjects we were learning, we delved into economics and business courses, went to a conference at UPenn, and really met some trailblazers in the finance industry from our community. And so when we came back to Cornell, we wanted to get involved in the finance organizations, investment clubs, because we had a real genuine interest in them. But we quickly realized the lack of diversity that happened within these organizations. I was one of the only Black people within my finance org, and I know Shek had a similar experience. And so it really cultivated this idea in establishing a space that was welcoming and inviting for members in our community that lacked those resources that these other organizations provided.
And Jack, yourself? Did you want to chime in?
Very similar experience there. I actually came into Cornell pre-med. I wanted to be a doctor, but that was only because I didn't have the exposure to various different careers in corporate America. And so after arriving at Cornell, I was able to be exposed to different finance organizations on campus and get that exposure to different careers on Wall Street, which piqued my interest. And so similar to Ermias, I joined a financial organization that aimed to equip students with the tools and resources to increase their financial literacy and ultimately land jobs on Wall Street. However, I was the only Black person in that organization, and which was really alarming because a lot of my friends coming from underrepresented backgrounds were very interested in getting access to financial literacy, as well as, pursuing careers on Wall Street, just like myself. And so we created Black Gen Capital as a way to break down those barriers and really close the access gap for students who look like me.
And tell us a little bit about narrowing the access gap. You talked about being the only minorities in situations in at your university, what are some of the issues that you guys have seen on campus and throughout your life where you've seen kind of this disparity?
Yeah, certainly. So we know that, diversity has been a big topic on Wall Street and corporate America in general. You see statistics like 1% to 2% of deal teams at finance firms are Black, and other very alarming numbers. And so, at Cornell, within the finance landscape, it sort of, resembled a microcosm of the actual industry itself. When you looked at some of the top finance clubs, you would see, a strong lack of diversity within them. And those clubs provide really, really helpful resources to help students get internships and jobs, which lead into really fruitful careers. And so that was one of the main issues that we saw and wanted to, face right on.
Kind of going off of that, another big issue is just the nepotism that prevailed in these types of organizations. A lot of the finance clubs, the leadership teams would reserve certain seats for like their friends and peers that they knew, as opposed to metrics like merit and actual like skill and qualifications for the organizations. And this is resembling in the entire industry on Wall Street. A lot of the times, you have to kind of know somebody who's working in the particular job that you're interested in order to even have a chance to apply. And so Black Gen really aims to kind of, disassemble that sort of dynamic and ensure that students who are exposed to the right careers, equipped with the right skills, are able to have a fair shot at reaching these careers.
And obviously, you two are seniors at Cornell right now. Once you leave, Black Gen Capital will still be at Cornell. What are you hoping the future of this organization will be?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is a very exciting topic for us because the initial idea of Black Gen Capital existed just at Cornell, but we quickly expanded to several institutions around the country very fast. And so we're currently at Georgetown University, Columbia University, as well as NYU, UMich, and currently establishing chapters at Princeton, UPenn, and Dartmouth. And so we hope to continue expanding our national expansion efforts. And ultimately, in order to do that, we first need to hire a full-time team. And so this staff is going to be dedicated to pursuing the mission of Black Gen Capital and ensuring that we can increase our impact to thousands of students around the country, as well as establishing more corporate partnerships. And so we're seeking to increase our partnerships with institutions that want to remain at the forefront of enhancing diversity and inclusion on Wall Street.
Got it. And have you had any successes so far working with these other institutions and expanding your footprint? Are you optimistic of the future?
Yeah, definitely. Now we have 10 corporate sponsors who are actually really engaged with our student body and all of our members. Looking at our statistics, 45% of our students who get hired after college are working with our corporate sponsors. And it shows that, those companies that are willing to take the leap and work with us and invest in our students are returning those benefits back to the companies.
And you talk about the students themselves. What has been the reaction from students on your campus seeing this organization built just for them? Have they been receptive? Have they been excited? And I guess, where do you see your membership going from here?
Yeah, they've been really excited. We've actually been able to grow from just 30 members during our launch in 2020 to now over 200 members across our 6 universities. And so interest is still very high, and every semester we recruit a new cohort of talented students. They've also just been really appreciative of the opportunities that they're now getting exposed to and the knowledge that they're now equipped with in order to not only accept these internships on Wall Street, but now succeed and secure the full-time jobs. We've seen over 100% of our seniors actually secure full-time jobs upon graduation. Students are now outpacing the industry average acceptance rates for these very selective internships by over 23 times. And so they're very, very thankful and appreciative of this opportunity. And that ultimately, we hope to continue moving forward.
Awesome. Well, you and Ermias are obviously doing amazing work, and this is just the beginning for the both of you, I'm sure. Can't wait to see what more you guys accomplish. And again, thank you both for taking out the time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Joining me now is Kimberly Bryant, founder of Black Girls Code, an organization focused on closing the opportunity gap for Black women and girls across the tech sector. Kimberly is an electrical engineer by training who has worked in both biotech and the pharmaceutical industries. Kimberly, really, thank you so much for joining us today. Look, when you, we have Kimberly with us, by the way. I don't see her. I hope we have her. Okay, well, hopefully. Well, Kimberly, let me tell you a little bit about Kimberly. Kimberly founded Black Girls Code in 2011. One of the questions I'm hoping to discuss with her is where the industry is right now, because we had a lot of focus. Okay, we're going to pause here for a moment. We're going to go to our sponsored content segment, thanks to our sponsors. So.
So many communities that haven't taken part in the gains we've made in air quality and water quality. And now these same communities are at the very front lines of climate change.
We're dealing with elementary school children who have been exposed to lead and arsenic.
We live close to slaughterhouses, dog food companies, chemical storage facilities, tank farms, railroad tracks.
Extreme weather events are more frequent, and when you already have a vulnerable community that is already environmentally degraded, you're going to have more flooding and ground contamination.
This is a historic moment. You have a collection of leaders from national environmental organizations, the directors of environmental justice organizations, signing an agreement that commits all of our institutions to work together on a set of policy solutions that puts economic, racial, and social justice at the core of what we're advocating for.
It strengthens our ability to pass the kind of climate change and environmental legislation that we all need.
In behalf of our children, our youth, the responsibility that we have to each other, and how the decisions that environmental groups are making, how those decisions really impact on the health, safety, and well-being of many of our communities.
It's important for the national environmental movement to work much more closely with communities of color to make sure we get the change we need that fights the climate crisis and brings economic and environmental justice to the communities.
We have made a commitment beyond our differences, beyond the scars that we as environmental justice people have on our bodies, minds, and spirits, to be able to recognize that we are all human beings and we are responsible for Mother Earth together.
I proudly commit to the equitable and just national climate platform and look forward to all of the real work we'll have to do to make this dream come true. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Roberts, a co-author of the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform and national co-coordinator of the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. I'm joined by other authors of the platform who are working across communities with leaders on the Hill to improve lives and livelihoods by encouraging equitable and just climate investment. We have the Honorable Harold Mitchell Jr., Executive Director of Regenesis Project, former state representative at the South Carolina House of Representatives, and Richard Moore, co-coordinator of Los Jardines Institute, as well as one of the founding members of the environmental justice movement. We'll start with you, Harold. Why is it important that we elevate environmental and climate justice right now?
Well, thank you, Michelle. In the Black and brown low-income communities where I have worked for decades in South Carolina and beyond, there's never been the luxury of focusing on one thing at a time. Everything is an emergency. People are dying from rare cancers linked to the toxic soup of chemicals in our water and air. Our health issues, including COVID-19, are compounded by the lack of access to decent and affordable medical care. We have an urgent need for national climate solutions that not only reduce greenhouse gas pollution, but also cut energy costs and advance racial, economic, and environmental justice too.
Thank you, Harold. Yes, low income and communities of color have been on the front lines of environmental injustices for far too long. Richard, I want to hone in on something Harold shared. How do you see race playing a role in both the harms of environmental injustice and the possible solutions?
Well, thank you, Michelle. I think kind of moving along, and if we look at the question of racism, as many of our elders, our community members, and many academics have written, that making that distinction between what affluent communities have versus what non-affluent communities don't have, including well-funding schools and reliable infrastructure, this undermines these communities' ability to participate equally in the economy and live safe, healthy, and prosperous lives.
Thank you, Richard. This is very true. The legacy pollution and other health and climate hazards leave many communities vulnerable. But I'm always inspired by our communities on the ground taking action. Between the recent infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better agenda, the Justice 40 initiative, and companies and philanthropies looking at how to invest in environmental justice, what should we be now paying attention to? I'll pose that question to both of you. Harold, let's start with you.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for that question. It's going to take big visionary investments to rebuild our nation's infrastructure and economy in ways that will protect the climate, clean up local pollution, reduce energy and healthcare costs, and create millions of good jobs. That's why the Justice 40 initiative is key to equitably building thriving communities. It's a commitment to direct 40% of federal climate investment benefits to underserved and environmental justice communities. And what would you say to that, Richard?
Thank you, Harold. Perhaps most importantly, we need to invest in job training and workforce development to create good jobs for those who have been left behind. It can be done. For example, establishing a civilian climate corps would create new fair wage jobs and strong benefits and train a new workforce to secure careers in the clean energy economy and building climate resilience in hard-hit communities across the country.
You are all speaking so many truths. It will take all of us together to continue this good work. I want to thank you all for being here today. To learn more about what's needed for environmental justice and to become part of the solution, visit us at ajustclimate.org. Please sign up for our email list to stay up to date on breaking news and developments from the platform. Back to you, Steve and Raquel.
Thank you. Well, our next guest is Mayor LeVar Stoney of Richmond, Virginia. He is also the president of the Democratic Mayors Association. Central to his vision for the future of his city is the Richmond Equity Agenda, a plan that aims to lay the groundwork for advancing justice and inclusivity. Welcome, Mayor LeVar Stoney. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
Well, for those who may not be familiar, first off, would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you came to be the youngest mayor elected to your city?
Well, yeah, to say that I'm the youngest mayor, it doesn't feel like that now. This is my 6th year in office, but prior to being the mayor, I was Secretary of the Commonwealth. I had a long career in Democratic politics, helping to get people elected. I was the first in my family to graduate from college. First in my family to graduate from high school as well. And so the issues of justice and opportunity have been very important to me, not just in my role as mayor, but in my previous parts of my career as well. So I get a great opportunity to help people. That's why I love being mayor.
Awesome. And we know one of your main focuses as mayor has been equity, and we know you have launched the One Richmond initiative. Can you kind of tell us about this initiative and some of the goals you are trying to accomplish there in your city? We already know you've already done so much in your tenure, but I guess what are some of the key agenda items for yourself at this moment?
Yeah, so when we all experienced the racial reckoning that occurred in the summer of 2020, and Richmond has a long history of injustices, and sometimes it's very difficult to talk about that. But Richmond is a home for history, and it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we thought that we would take the bad and the ugly head on. And so not only did we engage in removing the Confederate iconography all across the city starting July 1 of 2020, we thought we had to put some action behind some of the symbolism as well. So we created what we call the city's equity agenda. This is essentially an opportunity agenda that creates a working definition of equity that for us, which means empowering communities that have experienced past injustices and also removing barriers so that everyone in our city has access to opportunity and has access to success. And we apologize for the harms that the past my past predecessors may have caused, and these are a number of different injuries to marginalized communities like redlining, annexation, the erection of those Confederate monuments. And we put some great policy initiatives into this agenda that I think that we use as a framework in our budgeting and everything that we do. It's truly a roadmap. So whether it's economic justice, whether it's social justice, climate justice, criminal justice, all covered under our equity agenda, like I said, an opportunity framework.
Now, obviously, Richmond has its own unique, rich history when it comes to racial issues in particular, but nothing too far away from what we see across the country. And we know now that you are the president of the Democratic Mayors Association. And how do you think you can take what you've learned and what you've implemented in the city of Richmond and maybe mirror that in the agenda for all mayors?
Well, in my acceptance speech for the Democratic Mayors Association, becoming the president, I talked about how Democrats, but just elected leaders, period, have to get back to basics, the essentials for an individual to thrive. And I think that mayors specifically have an opportunity to play a role in the opportunity business, right? We can remove barriers for individuals so they can rise, and that creates economic mobility. And I think that more and more of those who are in elected office have to do that. And so I think about what we're doing with guaranteed income, for instance. We have the Richmond Resilience Initiative. We are finding individuals who are already fully employed, gainfully employed, but living paycheck to paycheck and are in danger of falling off the cliff. And so what we've done is we're providing $500 contributions to their income each and every month so they can ensure that they don't fall off the cliff, but also it gives them an opportunity to start saving for home ownership, start to not having to have two jobs as well. These are the sort of opportunities that I think that every elected official has to get involved with right now, because we know there are a number of people who are still suffering because of the pandemic and the economic downturn, and we got to get back to basics and helping them.
Right. And it looks like we do have an audience question from Margaret Pridgeon. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. We'll go ahead and have a listen.
My name is Marguerite Pridgeon. I'm Director of Federal Policy for the Corporation for Supportive Housing. My question is, what is your assessment of how the current Congress and administration have addressed these issues so far?
I'm grateful for the current administration's work on with American Rescue Plan and those programs that allow for us to emerge out of this pandemic. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask for the administration to go even further. I think that the president's Build Back Better plan is a solution for a lot of the ills that urban centers like mine experience on a daily basis, and never have enough funds to actually tackle these issues head on. And so I appreciate the infrastructure dollars that are coming out of the federal government, but I think that Build Back Better, whether it's passed in separate bills or if it's one huge package, will allow for urban centers, mayors across the country to attack these social ills that have haunted us for generations.
All right, Mayor Stoney, well, thank you so much for taking out the time and sharing your insights. Looking forward to seeing what more you do with the Democratic Mayors Association.
Thank you so much.
That was great. I should also mention Mayor LeVar Stoney recently had a great op-ed in The Hill, so go check that out. Back with me now is Kimberly Bryant, founder of Black Girls Code, an organization focused on closing the opportunity gap for Black women and girls across the tech sector. Kimberly, it's great to have you back. I know we had you there and then lost you. So listen, I mean, you have what I was saying before we got disconnected before was I'm so familiar with your work, but I also want to remind people of the environment at the time in which you founded Black Girls Code and you saw the need that needed to be addressed. And that was we had an appalling level of both women, people of color within the tech sector, And a lot of people say, well, there's discrimination and bias there, but we also had to address, folks' experience. And you really went head on into this. Tell us about the founding, but why you did this.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. The reason I created Black Girls Code back in 2011 was that I identified that there were very few Black women in the tech space. I was here in the Bay Area living with my daughter. I was working in biotech. And I was starting to really explore the tech industry from a startup perspective. And I was really surprised by the lack of Black women in those spaces and in those rooms where I was networking, and didn't really understand why I didn't see more folks that look like me or that look like my daughter. And I also found that in these individual opportunities my daughter was participating in, there are very few women and girls in that room as well as a young person that were interested in technology as well. So I really felt that in 2011, we had a serious problem from a pipeline perspective that was going to have a detrimental effect on the other side once these young women matured and were not a part of those folks that were creators in the tech industry. And so this vision for creating an organization to nurture this talent was born in this notion that we needed to have a seat at the table. And if we were not there now, we had to perhaps make that table for ourselves.
Look, part of the conversation, I think, today with so many leaders in the country is change is not easy. It's hard, to kind of make it real. You've talked a little bit about your daughter, and I love your tweets. I follow you on Twitter, and one of the tweets I have here is, you said one of your inspirations of this is your kiddo, and your kiddo, I think is, she's at A. Kai Morton. We have to tell us about that, but that she's gone into the Web3 space. So now she may have kind of gotten that way because she had a mom who was very, very attentive and thought that this was a great environment to expose her to. But not all children have that. So I'm just sort of interested in, how do you scale? How do you get structural change so that people realize that they are disadvantaging their children, their daughters, daughters of color in particular, but really all, it's also gender in this field. And I'm just interested in how you kind of approach this and get partners and allies in scaling the kind of experience you gave your daughter.
That's a great question. I think it's interesting for me in particular because now I live in Oakland, California, and our headquarters at BGC is in Oakland. But when I started Black Girls Code, I was actually in San Francisco. So right in the middle of the city that is unfortunately probably less than 1% people of color in terms of demographics. But it's really the hub, if you will, or it has been traditionally the hub of this technovation industry and this technovation wave. And I was in a very privileged position where I could put my daughter Kai in these expensive summer camps and workshops that cost thousands of dollars so that she could learn these skills. But I could go right across the bridge, now we live in Oakland, and see mothers that were unable to afford to give their daughters the same opportunities that I was able to give mine. And so this work that we did, like literally from the ground up. So when I started Black Girls Code, I had no support. I had a 401k, luckily, from my biotech company at the time, and I poured that 401k into this idea that these little Black and brown girls would come into a workshop and sit behind a computer rather than being outside and playing, and there's certainly value in that. But it was just that notion that if we plant this seed, then the fruits will arise. And it took 10 long years, literally, of hard work doing this work in our communities until maybe around 2013, 2014, we started to get more support, but we didn't get a groundswell of support literally into 2020. The summer of 2020, when this summer of reckoning, as I call it, really started to unfold, was the first time we had the support that we needed to really scale these programs that we've been doing for the past 10 years with very little support, but a lot of demand for the work and a lot of need for this work and this thing that we were building.
And of course, in 2020, the world was shoved online, whether it wanted to or not, because of COVID. And if you really had communities that were not connected, not of it, then they were even left further behind. I don't know if you know my friend Jim McKelvey. Jim was a co-founder of Square, but he created an organization down in Missouri and Miami and other places called Launch Code. And one of the lessons he learned from it, and I learned from him, is he would train people that would come out of coding schools and whatever, not just young people, but people of every age, some people who had health issues, some people who had various speed bumps in their lives, and he would turn them into world-class coders. But they had a really hard time getting jobs. And so he was creating talent that was being left, on the side of the road. And he'd become kind of a celebrity, so he began calling the CEO of Cisco and calling and saying, why aren't you hiring my people? And what they found, and I'm being very non-specific with this, but is that HR departments were very risk averse, and they wanted a kind of pedigree that looked a certain way from a certain place. I'm just interested to make this a real discussion. Isn't it not just training girls to code, black girls to code, it's also changing the way gravity works in HR departments, also changing the way the rest of the system sees and processes that talent. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think one of the words that's new for me lately is this concept that another fellow leader in the social change industry introduced to me called spaciousness. And, I think it's looking at the world from this frame of reference where leaders of color or innovators of color are giving the space to be their fullest selves and to change the lens of what a leader looks like, how a leader looks, what an innovator looks like. So I think it is absolutely about more than just creating this pipeline. We have to understand that we're now creating this space for this pipeline to enter places where their fullness and their humanity and how they show up in their fullness is not seen or recognized. So it's about systemic change. We're about addressing systemic issues. I have experienced this myself as a Black woman leader and a CEO and a founder, and that I'm expected to show up in a certain way. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that is not good. And that perception of how I should show up in a leader is often limiting into my ability to grow. So we need to change the systems and not focus as much of our energy on changing the folks that we're leading into the system via this pipeline. That is certainly what I'm seeing with the girls that are coming out of our program now is there's nothing wrong with who they are once they come to a Black Girls Code event for the first time. This is just about giving them skills and giving them the tools to be a success in whatever career they choose to pursue once they graduate. But there's more work to be done in how do we change these systems that they lead with fairness and equity and a broader lens of what success looks like.
I really appreciate what you just shared, and I just want to acknowledge, I know there's a little bit of messiness in Black Girls Code right now with its leadership and what's going on. I wanted to talk to you because you launched this and you saw how important this was. But I think you raised something really interesting, and I'd love to go just a notch deeper, because I sort of feel it and see it in a lot of places. We get norms and habits, and we're all supposed to look a certain way and do certain things. How much of that needs to be ripped apart and recreated so we actually get the kind of changes we're talking about? How confined are we into kind of a mediocrity of performance, if you will, and may not even be aware of it?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting is that when we look at the world as it is today, there certainly is a paradigm that is really based on a male gender model of leadership, primarily white men. And it's interesting that our white peers are allowed to fail up. We see this, and day to day, I turn on my computer, I hear the next story about a leader that did something perhaps not so nice to the staff. If it's a man, they're allowed to he did the best he could. Let's let him, just give him a little training and push him on forward. I don't see that same grace given to women in leadership more often than not. And so I think we really need to explore, how do we give safe space to fail and and get up and keep moving and keep leading these movements to our leaders of color, to our women in leadership roles, just as much as we give to our male counterparts. And I think that's the real conversation of what does leadership look like, and how do we build and support leaders and who continue to do this work in systems that are not meant to help them be a success. And how do we really invest in this, as I said, this notion of spaciousness for our leaders so that they can continue to grow and they can continue to lead and model for the next generation.
I really appreciate your leadership. I also, appreciate your willingness to come and, brainstorm and talk with me about this stuff, because I think we're all learning. I want to tell my audience that follow Kimberly, KimberlyBryant.eth on Twitter. And she's got, I love this picture. It says, so when I get on my little soapbox about this thing called a tech pipeline, ? This pic is what I mean. Almost 100 little black and brown girls in Oakland doing robotics this Saturday before Christmas. Just an endearing photo of like, this is what we're talking about, right? So thank you so much, Kimberly. It's a real pleasure to have you with us. Kimberly Bryant, founder of Black Girls Code. I hope you'll come back a lot more, because we need to talk more.
I would love to. Thank you for your support.
Now, I want to say, it was really great listening to Michelle Roberts in the interviews of our sponsor today, the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, which is sponsoring today's conversations. I've learned a lot about environmental justice from the founder of Environmental Justice. We have Dr. Robert Bullard, who is known to many as the founder of that whole section, the environmental justice world. He's a distinguished professor of urban planning and environmental policy at Texas Southern University. He's the author of 18 books on environmental racism and justice. He also sits on President Biden's Environmental Justice Advisory Council. I asked him a little bit about that just a short while ago on how all that's going. Fascinating interview. He's up now, Dr. Robert Bullard.
Dr. Bullard, thank you so much for joining us. Listen, I want to be candid. I think a lot of Americans who have not been victims of systemic racism don't think on the front end of this. You might understand their experience hasn't taken them there. But when we talk about climate change and we talk about who may be victims of that process, I think it's important for people to hear how race has figured so significantly into the infrastructure decisions we've made in the past, and how it needs to be worked into what our solutions and responses in the future. Can you help our audience understand why this is so important?
Well, Steve, I think it's really important that people understand that what gets built and what doesn't get built oftentimes is not really based on any objective criteria. Oftentimes, for example, discrimination in the past that occurred, say, 100 years ago with racial redlining can impact what's happening today in the 2020s. When you look at which communities are more likely to flood because of infrastructure is not put in place, which communities don't have trees, green space, parks, green canopy, they are actually hotter than neighborhoods with trees and green canopy because of basically this urban heat island. And so if you talk about where industrial pollution is more likely to be a hot spot, and again, because of zoning, land use patterns, industrial facility siting, following the path of least resistance, it's created vulnerability. And again, when you look at a racial lens, in the past, those inequities and vulnerabilities are pushed forward in the future. So those communities that are least able to afford and fend off the impacts of climate change are the very communities that will suffer and are suffering today first, worst, and longest. That's the racial justice, the equity lens, the health lens that really need to be applied to infrastructure and to climate policy.
Now, I've read about your past and you and your wife's work in bringing some of the first lawsuits that connected decisions on waste and where waste was going to, the racial composition of community. And they call you the father of environmental justice. And I guess my question is, that, as I understand, was around the 1979, 1980, quite a ways back. What has the I don't know how to frame this right, but what has really gone well and what has really gone badly since then? Do you feel like environmental justice is now part of the framework? I know you're an advisor on these issues to the Biden team. Are they listening to you? Do they hear you? Do you feel like you now have standing?
Well, you know, in 1979, that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And again, you're talking 40 something, 41, 42 years ago. Environmental justice then was a footnote. Today, it's a headline. We made progress, but there's so much progress that needs to be made because the communities that are, as I said before, that are on the fence line with industrial pollution and on the front line of climate change, they're still vulnerable, and they're made more vulnerable because of how dollars, tax dollars get spent. So when we talk about infrastructure, in the past, infrastructure like highways and roads, freeways, in many cases, that infrastructure was detrimental to many communities because of highways, in many cases, was the line of demarcation between what goes on that side and what goes on the other side of the highway. In many cases, highways ripped through Black and brown communities and destroyed stable communities. So we have to be careful not to assume that all infrastructure is created equal and that every community is getting their fair share of those tax dollars. That's why I think it's important when the president talks about Justice 40, sending 40% of those investments, or I'm sorry, benefits toward those communities that historically have been left behind that are disadvantaged. That's a great start, but we have to make that initiative real, and we have to make sure that we monitor it and have good scorecards to evaluate it, to make sure that we're not just promising. Promises are not the same thing as getting communities resilient and making them much more sustainable and livable.
You made this statement that I really appreciate because I sort of feel like I swim in these terms too. You're trying to figure out how to frame stuff. And you said there are all kinds of terms that have been used as a proxy for race, whether it's disadvantaged or underserved or vulnerable or marginalized. And you said basically when you peel back the onion skin of all that, we're talking about race, and we need to be much more just upfront and basic about it. And I agree with that. I've interviewed people like Anthony Fox and others, who were mayors and then went on to transportation and taught me about how so much infrastructure has divided communities and also fallen disproportionately on communities where race was a driver. I guess the real thing I want to get is I feel as if where we are as a nation is a product of lots and lots and lots of decisions. And so to undo that, it's like a huge, huge tanker ship. It's probably an overused metaphor, but it's not going to be a magic wand or a quick fix anyway. And I'm interested in systemic change and how you affect systemically attitudes, orientations, money, funding to undo some of this and still meet our climate needs, in terms of this. And I know that's a big question, but I'd love to get your insights on how to turn the ship.
Well, I think when we talk about climate change is more than parts per million in greenhouse gases. It also includes policies and frameworks that will address inequity, that will address vulnerability and disparities. And I think so. It means that bringing all the pieces together in terms of a interdisciplinary work, as well as whole of government approach that the administration is talking about. So when we talk about climate and talk about solutions, we're talking about transportation, energy, housing, food and water security, energy security. When we talk about the issues around land use, planning, and making sure that we do it right, as opposed to allowing just market forces to drive it. Market forces oftentimes has driven us to this path of least resistance and making sure that those with wealth and those with power can get in the front of the line. And so we have to talk about the issue of making sure that all of our residents in communities across the country have access to those things that make us healthy, make us resilient, and make us a much more secure nation, because climate change is a national security issue. And if we don't get it right, then we are not doing the best, operating the best interests of our nation.
My understanding, Dr. Bullard, is that some of you and your colleagues have been a bit disappointed in the slowness of the Biden administration in prioritizing this. What can they do better?
Well, I think the administration has to step it up, because we don't have, I've been working on this for 40 years. We don't have 40 years. We don't have, 20 years. I think the fact is that when we connect those dots with voting rights and saving our democracy and connect those dots with when it comes to an energy transition to that clean energy economy. And we talk about health and talk about access to healthcare. We talk about issues of affordable housing. All these things are connected. So it means that we have to push out programs and have that interagency approach so that the right hand knows what the left hand's doing. So we're not working at cross purposes. And I think they're getting it, but I think the speed of which the urgency of now is somewhat that needs to step it up. And I do think that there are lots of smart people inside of government, and there are lots of folks outside of government that are willing to work with in partnership. And I think we will get this right. We just have to move with the speed of that, faster than a moving train and a bullet. That has to happen right now, because the urgency of now is right now. And climate change is not something we talk about, happening 20 years from now. It's happening right now. And those frontline communities, those vulnerable communities, they don't have a lot of time to wait, especially with these horrific storms, dangerous, strong storms, and rain and flooding just happening year after year after year. We used to plan for disasters down in the Gulf Coast June through November, but now we have to plan for year round, with the winter storm Uri hitting us last year this time with this severe storm, and it's just knocked out our power. We lost power, we lost water, people were cold. So it's year round. And we have to realize that in terms of our planning, in terms of working with communities, especially working with our most vulnerable population that are most at risk.
Let me ask you, one last question, and I hope I get it right, but I know you don't only work at the federal level. You work all around the country. You work with, all forms of government, different layers and levels out there. I'm always interested in knowing whether there was a place or a pattern of teams or others that got this right in the right ways that other parts of the country can learn from. Are there standout experiences you've had in the last 40 years where you've achieved success and that the right, alignment of stars came together that we can learn from, and that other parts of the community and even the federal government can learn something from something that's gone well in the past on this front of environmental and racial justice?
Well, the best examples that I've seen working over these many years, 4 decades, is what I call the anatomy of success. And usually you have strong participation with community groups and organizations and networks, working with local government and having those partnerships, having community university partnerships where you can use the university, the smart people and the big brains, and work with the community-based organizations and the groups who really are closest to the problem, but they're also closer to solutions. When you find those types of collaboration, you're getting on the road to successful initiatives. And when the money follow need and money follow solution-oriented initiatives, I've seen a lot of work happening. And there's a lot of good work going on all across the country. And a lot of it is flying below the radar. It's not getting a lot of recognition. But I do think when we lift them up and show that what's working and show how it's working, other people can take notice and adapt, and make those things that work fit their needs. And we know we are a big country. We are a very diverse country. And I do think that there are lots of good solutions that can make a difference in how we do our policy, how we do our planning, and how we spend our tax dollars.
I really appreciate it. Dr. Robert Bullard, director of the Bullard Center for Climate and Environmental Justice. My notes here say that you've been on the front lines of environmental justice for more than 40 years. Folks, this guy created the front line of the environmental justice movement. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Bullard, and we look forward to talking to you again.
My pleasure.
Our final guest on today's program is Dr. Patrice Harris. She's co-founder and CEO of eMed, a digital point-of-care platform with a mission to democratize healthcare by expanding access to at-home diagnostics. She's also a former president of the American Medical Association. And I also want to say she is a friend. Dr. Harris, so great to see you again. I always love our conversations. But let me just ask you a blunt question that I know you are particularly ready to answer, I think. which is how does racial divide and stress in this country get in the way of a healthier nation?
There's no question that this current environment where there is so much division and racial discord is really affecting mental health. And so we now have a greater understanding. I think I, as a psychiatrist, have always had this understanding, but there's a greater appreciation of the importance of mental health into overall health. So this certainly, our current climate has been contributing to the lack of healthcare, but the good news is there's recognition that there are things that we can do. Now, I have to say that there is no magic wand or one-size-fits-all solution for the current discord. But one thing I have been saying, we have to start telling the truth, and we have to make a commitment to informed, evidence-based conversations if we want to get beyond some of this divide so that we can really have the conversations we need, to improve health for everyone in this country.
Dr. Harris, let me ask you another question on this, and I want to ask a little bit about EMED. I also want to tell you I've got my great colleague and friend here, Raquel Martin, who's a Washington correspondent for the Next Door Media Group, and I've asked her to, we're hanging out here today having this, she's got some questions for you too, but I guess the question I have on mental health and behavioral health is in the equation, the economic equation of how health is deployed and delivered in this country. I've always sort of thought the mental health part of that equation was given short shrift. Is there any correction in that? With all the healthcare reforms, with Obamacare, are we seeing the needle move a little bit so that those who need support in the mental health space are able to get it and to afford it?
So we are seeing some movement. Of course, you mentioned with the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion, so many more people were able to get treatment for their substance use disorders and other mental illnesses through Medicaid. So we've seen some movement, but not nearly enough. You are right. When it comes to mental health, and decades ago, it was carved out. And in some ways, you could understand that because it really was getting the short shrift. And so perhaps the thinking was back then that the only way to give it the attention it needs is to sort of carve it out. But again, now we know that it's very important to carve it back in. I'm a huge champion. So many others are huge champions of integrating mental health care into primary care. You said you were going to ask about EMED, but I do a lot and think a lot about technology. We've seen the rapid acceleration of the acceptance of telehealth right through this pandemic. And there's so much more to come and so much more opportunities regarding digital health and what we say as EMED is digital point of care. So I believe that, and the federal government, and this seems to be a bipartisan issue. Everyone realizes that we need more funding. Stephen, I know this, and people say, especially in DC, that, some people say, well, just throw money at the problem. And I agree that sometimes money is not enough. Money is not the answer. In the case of mental health, we need more funding. There's no question. Now, we also need to look at our system of care. We need to look at workforce. Again, we need to harness technology, but certainly funding is critical. There's no question about that.
Let me throw over to my colleague, Raquel Martin, who I think has a question along these lines. Raquel?
Well, hello, Patrice. First off, just wanted to say hello and thank you again for joining us. But definitely wanted to chime in. I know you talked about the digital health innovation. How do we ensure that we're not widening some of these disparities as we enter into this new era of digital innovation?
That is a great question. And actually, one of the reasons I decided to co-found this company. At the AMA, we realized that there were opportunities for AI and innovation to worsen health equities. And so in order not to do that, you have to talk about it up front. You have to plan for it. You have to make sure that it's not an unintended consequence, right? And so that is what we are thinking about at EMED. We really want to make sure that we widen access, but we are also at the very same time thinking as we develop technologies, again, at the beginning, in the design phase with our wonderful tech people, all right, what do we need to do to make sure we are not worsening health inequities within the technology, but we are also thinking about access. How do we communicate? Building trust in communities that have been traditionally underserved. So it's an inside game, but it's also an outside game. But there's no question you have to have those conversations at the very beginning. You cannot wait until the unintentional consequences occur.
Patrice, let me ask you a controversial question. I'm just sort of interested in the politics of healthcare. You led, a very important medical organization, and just a few minutes ago, we had the new director of the FDA. This is I don't even know his name yet, but Dr. Robert Califf, who is he was confirmed with a 50-46 vote. He lost 5 Democrats. Listen to these people: Joe Manchin, Ed Markey, Richard Blumenthal, Maggie Hassan, and Bernie Sanders. Probably the only thing in the world that these 5 senators would agree on was not supporting this FDA nominee. He picked up 6 Republicans, got through. But it just raises this interesting question, less about him, than more about the politics we're in today of like 50% plus one when it comes to science, healthcare regulation. What do we need to do to get greater consensus in some of these big questions? I know that's a meta question, like not a Facebook question, but like a, my own meta question. But about what we need to do to kind of begin getting out of just a bare minimum in these. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it was very worrisome to me over the course of the pandemic that there's been a lot of misinformation and disinformation, which certainly leads to the lack of trust in medical institutions. Now, listen, we all know, and if we think about the past studies and past incidents, that in certain communities, that lack of trust is warranted, has been earned. And so I would say that we need to make sure folks like me, folks like you, and listen, I talk about the media has a responsibility to make sure that there is credible scientific information that is out there. It is not opinion. In some ways, and I joked a little bit about this, maybe there are bubbles over, someone talking. This is opinion. This is fact. But it's going to be a slog, Steve. And so we have to make sure that those of us who are interested make a commitment to truthful conversations, the science. We have to hold social media institutions accountable. And again, that's an all of society approach. That's not a problem that you nor I can solve. But I think from a broader societal approach, we need to hold those accountable to make sure that the information is credible. As a child psychiatrist, listen, we know that through the pandemic, Zoom, social media, other entities allowed us to connect when we were sheltering in place. But we also have seen the dark side of this regarding eating disorders and mental health. And so it's important that we start with the truth. We call something the truth if it's the truth. We call it a fact. There are no other words for it. And I think those of us who are interested in that, we just keep plugging along. It is very frustrating, but I think there's nothing else to do but be on a mission to continue the truth telling.
And let me just, ask one last question, Patrice. I'm not sure, and I'm going to guess, and so sorry if I'm wrong. I think you're down in Miami, right?
I'm in Atlanta today.
Oh, in Atlanta today, but EMAD and your operation in Miami. So, and I asked that because one of the first mayors I interviewed early in COVID was Francis Suarez, the mayor of Miami. And I asked him what is his biggest concern, his biggest worry, and he said it's mental health. He said, look, we have suicides, we have attempted suicides, we have domestic abuse issues, we have a lot of people who need help, and right now they're not finding the cushions and the absorbers. I'd just love to get your insights as a professional in this area for people who are listening. What can we all do to be more a part of the solution in the mental health space than we are? Because some people may not have a practical understanding of what's needed in a time of major social stress.
Well, just a couple of things. I have a lot of answers to that. I worry a lot about stigma. Now, there are some generational differences, and the younger generation appears to be more willing to talk about mental health. By the way, I just have to commend Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka and multiple NBA and NFL players who have been open in talking about mental illness, because I think that lessens the stigma. It hopefully sends the message that you are not alone if you are experiencing any of these issues. And it's okay to seek help, by the way. And over the course of this pandemic, I've said it's also okay not to be okay. I've had my not okay days. But Steve, I cannot tell you that, it is, mental health care is readily accessible and available throughout this country. We are not there. We have to get there. And it's funding. It's looking at how we harness technology. It's matching. There are some folks, and especially our younger folks, who might benefit from some peer counseling over a chat bot. I mean, I think we should all be open to some new technology. We have to make sure the evidence is there and the science is there. We have to make sure there's a continuum of services. Stephen, I know we're about out of time, but as you know, in this country, we like to think in binary terms. We're either off or on, mask or not, instead of the nuances that are more difficult to talk about. But I think if we continue to work towards, again, increasing access, workforce issues, it's a long-term issue, we can get to where there's more equitable access to mental health care.
I always learn from you. Thank you, Dr. Patrice Harris, co-founder and CEO of EMED, former president and the first Black woman president of the American Medical Association. Good friend. Let me know when you're in D.C., and thanks so much for joining us today.
I sure will. Thank you, Steve.
That brings us to the end of our program. A very big thank you to the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform for its support, and to all of you attendees. For anybody who missed these conversations this afternoon, we're going to have the video from all these conversations up on our website shortly. Raquel Martin, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you had a good time.
Had a great time. It was
You'll come back.
Definitely would come back.
Yeah,
definitely enlightened conversation with so many great leaders. So happy to have me.
Oh,
I'm happy to be here. Glad you had me.
Well, this is my first tangible benefit of our new partnership with Nexstar, so thank you. Look, I want to thank everybody for joining us. These are important issues. Listen to the videos, share them. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.